clear faster non-performing loans. And fifth, of course, is continued financial support from international community to Africa. And IFC, for instance, plans to double its investment from about 5, including mobilization, to $10 billion in the coming years. So if you were to see the slide, I would say next slide, please. But the first slide on those forces I really want to focus on is urbanization. Urbanization, as I said, has been encouraged in past years in Africa by a demand for services, which is better supplied in cities, and that includes health, education, electricity, digital, but also security. And we believe that the COVID has further reinforced that trend. And the trend is huge. In the next 3 decades, Africa will need to build cities to host an additional billion people. We need to create cities for 1 billion people in the next 3 decades. Of course, challenges are huge because as we've seen so far in the past that cities have expanded mainly informally and in an unplanned manner. But the work is really underway to strengthen what we call the regulatory frameworks, the land titling, the construction licensing, the tax regimes, and so forth, so as to turn cities into efficient and competitive cities. And as cities become more efficient, they generate additional income, and of course, they generate new demand patterns. And therefore, we think that there are huge investment opportunities that are emerging and will continue to emerge in the next 3 decades in, of course, housing, and that means construction, of course, but also finance, so supply and demand, urban infrastructure, such as urban transport, water, sanitation, services, education, health, finance, and also leisure, because we see the middle class growing, and lastly, retail. The next fundamental driver of change in Africa is regional integration. And regional integration is not just a word. This is something which is already happening in Africa and has been happening for the last 20 years. But I give you a few statistics to mention that. First is the share of trade, intra-trade between African countries as opposed to trade between Africa and the rest of the world has doubled in the last 2 decades, and now the level of intra-trade in Africa is almost at par with other developing continent economies. Second, the nature of the goods which are being traded within Africa internally is of higher value addition, more diverse than the goods and services that are being exported and imported from and to Africa. Third, very importantly, we observe a phenomenon of per capita income convergence since 2000 between African countries, namely the poor countries have grown systematically faster than the richer ones in the last 2 decades. And that's a consequence that you typically expect from regional integration. That may be not the only reason, but that's certainly aligned with what we see on regional integration. Now, efforts are also underway to further accelerate such integration at the continental level. Of course, you heard about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is a long-term proposition, but it's already started to be implemented, and it will free the movement of goods and services between African countries over the coming years. Second, very important is that the trade infrastructure is getting built, and we're talking about corridors, so logistical, transport, etc., customs, trade facilitation, but also regional payment systems to facilitate trade across countries. And therefore, we believe that regional integration will generate investment opportunities in a number of sectors in general, of course, but also, of course, in the goods and services that are needed to accompany the integration, trade finance, e-commerce platforms, transport equipments, and connective infrastructure, but also in the development of regional value chains. And here we see in particular agribusiness, light manufacturing, and e-services are very promising. The third force is digitalization, which offers immense opportunities to leapfrog and to innovate in Africa. And we see that in some aspects, Africa is already a front runner with mobile payments, which are much more developed in Africa than in the rest of the world. And that gives us hope and and reinsurance that Africa could adapt rapidly those technology to its needs in Africa. Of course, there will be a few challenges, but we see that there are two. I mean, one of the main events that will happen in the next 2 years is Africa will be connected to two new submarine cables that will multiply Africa's broadband capacity by 10. And this increased capacity could tremendously lower the cost of accessing internet. And it's still a problem in terms of affordability and in terms of infrastructure in access from an infrastructure perspective, if, of course, sufficient competition is maintained between internet service providers. Now, with the lower cost, there will be opportunities. One constraint, though, to the development of the digital economy is the lack of digital skills and the weak economic systems in many parts of Africa. So you have the infrastructure, but you don't necessarily have the supply of skills and ecosystem to use it at its best capacity. And so one model that we see developing across Africa is the expansion of digital services through the reinforcement of ecosystem in a few number of selected cities such as Nairobi, Lagos, Cairo, Jobo, from where technological services, platforms, etc., which are adapted to African needs, could be exported. So opportunities for us here lie in the following. Of course, soft and hard infrastructure to deploy the digital infrastructure across Africa. We're talking about cables, towers, data centers, the development of digital platforms, telehealth services, virtual learning, e-commerce, agtech, finance, but also creative industries, again, because we see a middle class coming and in demand for creative industries, the Netflix of Africa, and of course, the regional expansion of technological companies, which I've just mentioned before. And then we'll finish with a last set of opportunities that relates to climate change. We know that Africa is probably most exposed to natural disasters, that investment needs in adaptation to get more resilient against those natural disasters, but also in mitigation to accompany the development of Africa, which will demand a lot of energy. Those investment needs far exceed government financial capacity to finance them. And therefore, the private sector is expected to finance those investments. Now, of course, the challenge is to turn these investments into bankable projects. So what are the trends that make us believe that there will be more and more bankable projects to be financed by the private sector? One, of course, is the technological progress. We've seen a huge reduction in the cost of renewable energy, climate-smart agriculture, but also green housing. That makes, of course, projects by themselves more bankable. And second, we see that available finance for climate-related projects is increasing. It has not yet, you've heard about the COP26 and the commitment to finance $100 billion of investment to developing economies in the next year. We're not yet to that level, but we are getting close to it, very close to it. And a big part of it, so far about a quarter of it, has gone to Africa. We see also the huge development of green bonds, which are now outperforming markets. Very few of them have been issued offshore from Africa, one in South Africa, a few onshore in Morocco and the like. And maybe one problem here, so huge promise for development, but one problem here is the pipeline of bankable projects that would underpin those issuances. But there's a lot of work ongoing again to, at the technical level, to improve the bankability of projects. And I'm talking here about the development of solid public-private partnership frameworks that prove to be successful, for instance, in the development of scaling solar in Africa. Second is the regulation of green finance, for which there is a lot of support being given currently to countries. The third, when we're talking about adaptation, is the development of information systems for investors, in particular, being more aware of investment plans that will be developed by the government and how can the private sector contribute to them. Early warning system to operators to really understand the cost and benefit of adaptation investment. Something else that I see very keen to develop is what we call upstream project preparation, being really able to bring to the table projects which are ready to be financed because they are bankable and with all the guarantees needed. And last but not least, very important, sectoral reforms in a number of key sectors. I'm talking of energy, or to make utilities more financially sustainable, creating competition, and in the urban sector where a lot needs to be done still yet to facilitate investment from the private sector in housing, in transportation, and the like. So therefore, we see here opportunities in renewable energy, wind, solar, battery storage. We see investment opportunities in climate-smart agriculture, in retrofitting buildings for energy efficiency, investment opportunities in green urban transportation and in green finance, including insurance mechanisms against natural disasters. And to give you an example, at AEF, we see that investment opportunities related to that kind of investment to address climate change in South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire alone could amount to $300 billion in the next decade. So I could go on this topic, but I think I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sebastian, for these interesting insights. And I think that forms a very good basis for discussion. So thanks for your contribution. We now have the opportunity to discuss some of your thoughts and additional aspects with a high-ranking panel. And let me invite first His Excellency Yusuf Tuga, the Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Nigeria to Germany, to come in here. Ambassador, I think we heard that IFC would expect Africa to come back to a growth phase of 3 or 4% annually, but that it might be slower compared to the rest of the world when it comes to economic recovery. So my question is, from what you see in Nigeria, your country, first of all, would you agree to that analysis? And secondly, what can we do, politics and business, to support a recovery as fast as possible?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation, Mr. Desus. I agree, of course, by and large with what has been presented. What I would like to emphasize is, in order for this recovery to take place, I think it's important to take a perspicacious look at what the African countries have themselves prepared and to work in tandem with them. In the case of Nigeria, we responded to the COVID-19 crisis with the National Economic Sustainability Plan, which is a 2.3 trillion Naira plan. I will not, attempt translating that into figures in dollars right here, but it's 2.3 trillion Naira, out of which we're building, for instance, he talked about urban, the need for urban housing. We're to build 5 million solar homes from that plan. So these sort of things create opportunities. But importantly, there is the overwhelming need for infrastructure development. And this is where I think both private sector and development finance institutions can play a very pivotal role. Take, for instance, what we're doing in Nigeria now, constructing a $2 billion Kano-Maradi rail project, which fits into a lot of the things that Mr. Desus has described and outlined. It fits into the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, linking two countries, one that would be considered, for lack of a better word, poorer or less economically endowed. That's Niger Republic, and Nigeria, which is somewhat more economically endowed. this has been spearheaded by a European consortium that managed to successfully outbid a Chinese group for the project. But what we have been experiencing is an unwillingness to participate on the part of export credit agencies and even on the part of some of the commercial banks that started out participating in it. This was born out of a collaboration of blended financing between development finance institutions and commercial banks and export credit agencies. But what's happening? A lot of European export credit agencies have pulled out on the premise of security concerns that the environmental, social, and impact assessment cannot even be carried out. But that is far from the truth. On the ground, we have an American that has lived in Nigeria, for instance, for the last 30, 35 years. She is Caucasian. She knows the terrain very well. She's part of the team conducting the environmental, social, and impact assessment. So if there was any risk, I certainly think that someone like that would not be risking herself going in between Katsina and Niger Republic, conducting the environmental, social impact assessment. So we've had a situation where KfW, the German development institution, looking further afield, looking towards Asia for replacements for the export credit agencies that don't, European export credit agencies that don't have the appetite to participate in this project. So this is where I think we need support, we need participation, and then we'll be able to create the jobs that we need to cater for the population that we're going to have. Nigeria, as I keep repeating, is going to be 400 million by the year 2050. It's expected. One out of every 6 or so Africans is a Nigerian. So we need the infrastructure to be able to address the challenges that are before us. I'll stop here. I don't know how much time I have.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think you made a very important point, and I'm sure we'll come back to the question of financing of huge infrastructure projects, international guarantees, and how we can make sure the financing, the banking system can provide the assistance needed to make projects happen. Before we do that, I'd like to invite our remaining panelist, Dr. Markus Till. He's the president for Africa of Bosch Group, one of Germany's largest employers, I think. He's connected from South Africa, I believe, and just before we go to a more in-depth discussion on financing mechanisms, of course, we will be interested to hear about your perspective. How is Africa developed under the current crisis? What is your expectation when it's going to be over? And what do you see in terms of business dynamics? How is Bosch Group preparing for the time after the crisis? What are your ambitious plans for the continent?
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefan. I mean, I think I would want to split my answer in 2 sections. The first thing is that we've not experienced a crisis. And, there was a kind of a crisis because it was very difficult to travel. Although within the African continent, that's actually not so difficult any longer. As long as you do a PCR test before you fly, maybe you need to do a PCR test when you arrive, then everything is negative. Then otherwise, also there's so many Africans living under conditions that doesn't really help social distancing or physical distancing. So there's so many studies, serological studies, that many people have probably already had 4 times COVID. And now in South Africa, for example, if you look at the hospitalization rate, I mean, everyone looks at the positivity rate, that is skyrocketing faster than the 3rd wave. But if you look at hospitalization in South Africa, is 1/4 of what it was in the 3rd wave, and there's hardly anyone ventilated. So, and if I'm in Nairobi or I've just been in Morocco, I'm in Morocco and I have now closed the borders. I've been a few times in Egypt, also in Ghana. Unfortunately, I couldn't go to Nigeria for quarantine reasons this past 12 months. business has continued. I mean, in 2020, 2021, hospitality sector was suffering big time and is again suffering, unfortunately, in particular in South Africa. But industry in general has continued. And so we are not so affected to a certain degree as the Bosch Group because we are not active in the hospitality sector. And in that sense, in 2020, we suffered mostly under supply chain constraints. But now in 2021, we probably have the best year ever of Bosch history in Africa. People buying washing machines, people buying power tools. We continue to convert, working with artisans in the various African countries. And so that has made me very optimistic. So that is one thing that is very particular now to Bosch. A second topic, and we hope that this will continue going forward, and to a certain degree, one has again an interesting perspective from Europe to Africa, and talking about a crisis in Africa, which is possibly more caused by travel restrictions that Europe is imposing on Africa or Africans than it is really the crisis which is caused by the African economies. The challenges that we just heard about, lack of infrastructure, energy, I think, I mean, everyone knows they were there before COVID and they are still there. But I'm actually much more optimistic that Africa will now tackle them in earnest. And that is, let me give you the example of the automotive industry. I'm vice president of the African Association of Automotive Manufacturers. And when we started off 5 years ago, I think it was very much an uphill journey, an uphill battle, trying to convince African governments to join our Pan-African Autopack vision. That vision of producing in Africa, for Africa, 5 million vehicles, or at least 5 million vehicles by 2030, 2035. We've just heard about regional integration. That is the prerequisite for making that vision happen is regional integration. Just, if you look at Europe, more than half of European countries are part of the automotive value chain. Today in Africa, we have 2 hubs, Morocco and South Africa, but there is a potential for more hubs in the West, in Northeast, like Egypt, in the East. And there's many feeder industries that could come, copper industry, the copper belt. We've now just had a meeting in the DRC regarding batteries. And let me just finish 1 minute or 2 minutes to tell you why I'm so optimistic. I think in the last 12 months, there's been made so much progress since the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat has been put in place now. Also the consultations between African Union Ministers of Trade and Industry. Automotive industry is one of 4 pillars that they want to push forward. And we as the private sector are now asked every 6 weeks to participate in retreats of the ministers. And there's a very intensive engagement between us. Afrika-Vereinte Deutsche Wirtschaft is also part of it. The VDA is part of it. There's so much happening right now that really makes us to believe that what we thought maybe would be a dream 5 years ago now will become a reality. And majority of the ministers, when we met in Ghana, I think majority of the ministers of trade and industry of the African Union were present. There was only a very, very small minority that couldn't agree on the rules of origin that we proposed that would make sense. Afreximbank is coming to the forum, and European Union has committed to also support, and that's why possibly now Africa having the time to deal with itself of the last 12 months, because there was so many travel restrictions, might have also had some good effect in terms of now really making progress on the African Continental Free Trade Area, regional integration in the automotive industry. And I'll stop here and we can talk further later.
Thank you so much. I think that is amazing, and it's also good news to hear that maybe the crisis did not affect industries and international investors as much as one might assume reading the newspapers and seeing the numbers in terms of GDP contraction. But so you're basically saying it has moved on as before, but there is still the same problems as before when it comes to missing infrastructure, energy supplies, etc. And maybe that's something we should discuss in a bit more detail, how we can make sure that now after the crisis we can go back to before and even do better by accelerating investment in that sector. Sebastian, thanks for your great keynote and introduction. I think you mentioned a few areas where IFC can provide assistance in terms of financing mechanisms, supporting the sort of early stage development of new projects. But what else would you need, or would the international financing system need, so that we can make a difference and be much faster than before? We have Germany taking over the G7 presidency in a few weeks from now. So what do governments and multilateral institutions need to do in order to give it a push after the crisis so that we can get back to normal business as soon as possible?
Thank you, Stefan. That's a very relevant question and difficult one. Just to rebound on the two previous speakers, I would like to note as well that the responsiveness of governments in Africa has been tremendous, has been extremely impressive in terms of response to sanitary problems, but also to the economic problems. And of course, some countries have limited buffers, limited finance to address, to try to support as best their economies. But we've seen a lot of really good efforts to really address the challenge that was posed by the crisis. And I agree with you also with Marcus that, as I said, that to me there was still a contraction in Africa, and it was mainly due to the decline in external demand for the goods and services, not the supply side condition in Africa. It's not like industry was completely disrupted, etc. But the demand for the goods and services declined, and not only in tourism but also in commodities, etc. And that it has an impact on the African economies. Now, what should we do going forward? I just mentioned that, of course, I will speak first for IFC. So IFC, as part of the World Bank Group, is more than committed to support Africa's recovery and development, and this commitment actually was made before the crisis, where we should invest much more resources and much more larger share of World Bank Group resources into Africa, including in small countries in Africa, the fragile and the island countries in Africa, up to 2040. And IFC committed, which is quite difficult for IFC, committed to really double its footprint in fragile and island countries in Africa by 2030. And we are deploying instruments to do that. One of them is de-risking, where we're trying to address some of the points that the ambassador mentioned. We try to really encourage investors to come in difficult markets where macroeconomic risk, fragility risk are important, and we can support them to do that. And there's a lot of technical assistance being provided also to increase the pipeline of bankable projects that could be financed by the private sector. The third thing that we are doing, which I didn't mention much, but to me as an economist is fundamental, is the continuation of domestic reforms and regional reforms. Regional reforms are moving on. We see regional integration going on, but there's still a big agenda in terms of domestic reforms on many African countries. Of course, public finance is one, managing public finance is one, and even more important in coming years because debt levels are higher and therefore vulnerabilities are higher in many countries. But there is also a lot of reforms to be handled on markets. I'm thinking of, in particular here, the role of the need to address competition issues in many markets. Competition is still a problem for many investors to come in, and of course for firms to compete for a best outcome. That's what I would say. I think that's the finance. The finance is here. The African firms, multinational firms, will be probably very responsive to opportunities. The signals are there, and we are working with governments and with the private sector, because we really rely a lot on what the private sector is telling us to try to improve the business environment in Africa for those investments to materialize. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Tuga, I think what has been mentioned a number of times is that regional integration and the free trade agreement that is going to play a critical role for the further economic development of the continent. Now, we've seen that maybe even as a consequence of the pandemic, there is pieces and areas where instability increases in Africa. We've seen some coups, some unrest and difficulties, less so in Nigeria, but I mean, if you look at Mali or Guinea or whatever, there's quite a few countries affected. So would you say there's a risk of indirect consequences and instability, indirect consequences of the pandemic and instability in the region, slowing down that economic recovery process? And what is Nigeria doing to support some of the neighbors in staying stable?
Well, thank you. Well, Nigeria just finished hosting the ECOWAS leaders. We just concluded an ECOWAS summit where some of these issues were being discussed, particularly to do with security and the impact we're having on each other. The conflict in Mali, the mess that has been created in Libya. These are all, they have ripple effects and ramifications that are being felt even in Nigeria. In the northwest of Nigeria, these are some of the concerns. So some of the security issues are to do with each other, with our neighbors, which is why the ECOWAS leaders got together to see how they can approach it. Have a common approach and tackle it. But beyond that, I think it is important for us to visit the issue of the securitization of migration. The fact that migration, irregular migration or illegal migration, if you will, and Islamic jihadist terrorism were approached in the same manner, which led to the securitization of the Sahel region, for instance, under the EU Sahel strategy. These are things that really need to be unpacked, to be understood, to look at the impact of it, and perhaps maybe the EU can adjust its approach accordingly, and to work with the African countries themselves in tackling some of these issues. There was a time, if you remember, not long ago, when the West African region had ECOMOG, under the leadership of the Nigerian military. We're not sold weapons anymore because at the back of the minds of several principal actors, Nigeria is still a military dictatorship. We haven't had a military dictatorship in place since 1999. We've had 6 consecutive elections. So some of these concerns for human rights abuse and they're blown out of proportion, and even more so with the echo chambers that are created by social media today. So it's and it's not, I keep saying it's not enough. You can't write off Germany, for instance, for investment if there's a problem in Chemnitz when you're looking to invest in Bavaria or Munich. So it's a huge continent. And there are lots of opportunities, and there are several places where there's absolutely no conflict. So we need to understand this and adjust the approach. And just like Mr. Jesus has said, project preparation is key. And on the private sector side, we need to do more in terms of structured solutions towards de-risking. And towards encouraging private sector to invest even more in Africa. And we can do this also by leaning on governments, on decision makers to revisit the issue of retention ratios, for instance, with the export credit agencies. In the case of Nigeria, we attract a 10% retention ratio, whereas other African countries are attracting 5%, for instance. And when you ask, why does Nigeria have a higher retention ratio than maybe the next smaller African country, the response is that we have, our rating. BB or whatever, is not high, is not good enough. But then if you follow up with a question to say, okay, so those that have a 5% retention ratio, do they have a better rating than Nigeria? They don't. So, these sort of issues really need to be unpacked and addressed in such a manner that, would help. And, we're neighbors, Mediterranean in Latin means water in the middle of land, not the other way around. So it's just a pond in between us. What affects one continent affects the other with regards to Europe and Africa.
Thank you so much. I think you made, again, a very important point, and maybe this is the right time to ask for governments to revisit their approach towards Africa, migration, security, terrorism, but also financing and guarantees, as we are about to get a new government in Germany, and some of the international initiatives, G8, G20, etc., are about to look at their strategies for the next year. So, Dr. Till, maybe we can build on that comment of Ambassador Tuggar and look in a bit more detail at climate change, which I think is going to drive very much the agenda of these international organizations and fora. Bosch obviously is known for its thought leadership on sustainability, energy efficiency, mobility, etc. So do you see a chance that we can also revisit the approach to climate change internationally, now taking it into account Africa? Sometimes my impression is that people are looking at those that are the big emitters today, but we might miss the fact that if we don't jointly work on new technologies in Africa, Africa is going to be the next big emitter in a few years' time, and that we need to take action today. And why not bring in European and German investors, bring in green technology, and make it possible for these investments to find the right financing mechanism? So from a German business perspective, do you think Africa is going to be the next green continent, and what needs to be done in some of these international summits and fora that are coming up?
It's again a very, I think, a question that would require a very complex answer. So in many areas, I would say that sustainability should play a role, but also economical improvements of the lives of the people. So one needs to optimize in Africa, in our point of view, and also as the automotive industry, in three dimensions. The macroeconomical situation, which is related to balance of payments and how much money is actually available. And there again, multilateral financing could play a role. The second one is microeconomical, what is affordable, and then the third one is ecological. But I think that there is a very straightforward answer, particularly if we're looking at the European Union and Africa in terms of the Green Deal and hydrogen. So if one also wants to have an energy transition in Europe, hydrogen must play a much bigger role. And because green hydrogen is likely not to be able to be produced so much over the next 2 decades in Europe, but in Africa, whether it's ECOWAS or whether it's Southern Africa, there's huge potential. And so in terms of investing in hydrogen technologies, that could be then either, if one believes that, for example, hydro dams are also green energy, but also many of these other technologies, but also make it work for African countries. So we, for example, again, as the automotive industry, could believe that for trucks and buses, which are, again, extremely important also for the general economical issue, just to mention now, less than a normal truck on an African road has an average speed less than 30 kilometers per hour, compared to in Europe maybe 80 or 90, and that adds to cost, logistics cost, many other things. So if one can combine greening, for example, transportation, and in the first instance, I would rather look at hydrogen for trucks and buses than other technologies. There one could actually have huge amount of investment because hydrogen is needed in Europe, and there could also again be many of the financing mechanisms that G7 are talking about, or the EU is talking about, that could help both the industry in Africa as well as the industry in Europe.
Thanks so much. We cannot close this meeting without talking about the health situation, of course, of the continent. I think what we've seen is that in some cases, the approach to work with multilateral organizations in providing vaccine doses, etc., has been too slow to be successful to deliver what needed to be delivered. So we've always been trying to advocate for more private sector involvement in setting up factories to produce vaccines on the ground in Africa. Sebastian, what is IFC doing to support this? And is there anything we can do to further accelerate the process?
So thanks, Stefan. I will be short there. IFC has been financing, I've been extremely active in trying to actually support the development of factories for vaccine, but also drugs in general in South Africa, in Kenya, and we had massive investment last fiscal year in those that we will continue. I don't know if I can mention the firms, and I don't know if Jan wants to expand on that, but yes, this is one of our the main initiative that we took last year was really to try to step up our engagement on the health side, and in particular on the supply side for those factories to produce vaccines and other drugs. It's in the tunes of billions of dollars.
Thank you. You make my life easy because that allows me for a final question to our guest of honor, Ambassador Tuga, before we close the session. So Christmas is approaching, the end of the year is coming close. If you had one wish free to the new German government in terms of how they would approach Africa, investment in Africa, security, what their new strategy should look like, what would that wish be?
Well, to begin with, engage more with Africa's representatives here in Berlin. That's the African ambassadors. Give them more access, engage them more, and that way, we will be able to understand each other more. We're in the best position to explain to Germany, to the German government, what our governments have planned, and that way there's better synergy, and we are, of course, exceedingly, appreciative of the priority Africa has been given by Germany in particular, by the German government. But the good intentions cannot materialize into positive outcomes without that synergy. And the best way to create that synergy is that better understanding. And of course, we are a bit apprehensive now because many ambassadors noticed that Africa didn't get a mention when the foreign minister gave her first speech. So I'm sure that does not mean that Africa is not being prioritized. I'm sure it's covered by the mention Africa brought in the coalition agreement. But our hope is that what follows the action means better understanding, better engagement. And what was just mentioned about hydrogen is one such area that I think there's a lot to be done. A lot of African countries already have the supply and value chains to take advantage of green hydrogen for Europe and blue hydrogen for us. We could do with blue hydrogen back home while we're producing green hydrogen for export.
That's a big wish, but let's pray and work all together so that we can make that wish come true. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of our panelists and to all participants. I think for me there are some key takeaways. First of all, we learned that developments in Africa, even now economic developments, order intakes for industry, are better than some of the numbers might suggest. They are all average numbers for the continent, of course. And that leading industry representatives have recommended for investors to look at Africa right now. I think before the crisis, we were on a good growth path that might or might not come back slower than in other parts of the world. But here, this is not destiny. We can influence the development by accelerating, by taking action, by moving. And of course, by contributing to the supplies with vaccines. And thirdly, the main challenges are more or less unchanged compared to before the crisis: energy, infrastructure, healthcare systems, etc. And there's huge opportunities, and we should go for them, but we would need some political support, both on a multilateral and a bilateral basis. And we hope that the new German government is going to prioritize this and provide the right financing and guaranteeing instruments, including reviewing some of the harmless guarantee conditions that have been mentioned. So with this, let me thank all of our panelists. Thanks for taking the time, for joining us from all over the world, from Washington, D.C., from Berlin, from Johannesburg, and of course from Frankfurt. And I think with this, we let you review your strategy on Africa, all of the participants, and we hope to see some of you on the continent next year, and certainly see some of you participating in the next Africa Europe Forum, for which we will risk bills as soon as possible. All the best, have a good day, and thanks for joining. Bye.
Thank you.